Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes, and there are not a lot of things that Americans are united on across our vast political divides that you could get a big majority of Americans to agree on. But a pretty big majority of us agree that Donald Trump is not very likable and that Donald Trump is a loser. And the reason that I'm starting off with those very obvious facts tonight is because Donald Trump and his supporters are trying to con us into forgetting them. And that persistent effort is part of what was so galling about the ex-president's town hall earlier this week. The truly awful part was not just that Donald Trump was given 70 minutes of national airtime to say whatever he wanted. It was the setting in which he did it. The town hall was presented to America with an audience that whooped and hollered and laughed at every deranged thing that came out of his mouth. It appeared to be a unanimously supportive group. And that is part of the con job that CNN was complicit in on Wednesday. In fact, according to a Republican political consultant who was at the town hall, the network encouraged that behavior. Quote, the floor manager came out ahead of time and said, please do not boo, please be respectful. You're allowed to applaud. Now, I have to say, as someone who's worked with live audiences, quite a bit actually, that kind of direction when we're doing like a live show is accepted and sensible when you're doing a normal show, right? But that's not what this was. This was presented as a town hall with a presidential candidate, as if it were an actual forum in an organic setting with real unfettered reaction. And at least from the perspective of the Republican in the audience, what was portrayed on air did not reflect the reality in the room. Quote, there were plenty of people in that room that were ardent supporters of President Trump, and no matter what he said, they were ready to jump out of their seats and applaud. But there were also people that sat there quietly disgusted or bewildered. In a TV setting, you hear the applause, but you don't see the disgust. So Trump did not have the entire room on his side. Make no mistake, even if it certainly came across that way on TV. Those observations are backed up by the data that we have. While Donald Trump still has a lot of support within the Republican Party, it is not unshakable. Another Trump nomination, another Trump presidential candidacy, is not inevitable. Yes, he is the front runner to win the nomination with a current polling average of 52%, far ahead of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis or any other challenger. Yes, he appears to be the strongest candidate at the moment. There's no question. A majority of Republicans do remain really disconcertingly trapped in Trump's alternate universe of delusion and lies, particularly about the 2020 election. Fully 63% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents say that Joe Biden did not legitimately win. But, and here's the big but, and this is key when we're looking at numbers like that, right? The other part of that, the nearly 40% of that same group, they do think the election was legitimate. That is something to work with. That's a big chunk of people. That translates to tens of millions of potential voters, Republicans and those who lean that way, who see through what has become the foundational big lie of Donald Trump and his candidacy. And that chunk of people, that 37%, is also evidence it's way too soon for Republicans, conservatives, and everyone else to throw in the towel and give up, to resign themselves to another Trump win in the Republican primary, not actually go out and make the argument against him. During that town hall, while we were doing our show here the other night, I had on my dear friend, Rachel Maddow. And we were talking about this very topic, which is that democracy requires making arguments to people, persuading people, communicating with and mobilizing them. There is an argument to make to Republican primary voters that Donald Trump is stuck in the past. He's a loser who can't move on from his loss and his lie about the 2020 election. And as the data show, there's a receptive audience for that. We also heard it from several Republican primary voters in a focus group that CNN, to their credit, convened after the town hall.
I think it's time to move on from the election, the 2020 election.
I'd like him to move on. I would like him to stop talking about it.
I don't think anybody wants to hear about 2020 at this point. Everybody wants to hear about 2024, the future, and what comes after that.
Personally, I'm getting tired of hearing about it. I'm very much more so interested in the problems that we face now.
I definitely do think he believes it. I think he's very passionate about it, or else he probably wouldn't still be talking about it. But I think that it's time for him to move on. He needs to talk about what he's going to accomplish in 2024.
Now, let me be clear here, okay? Given where I'm coming from, my concern about the state of American democracy, my own personal politics, personally, I think, let's move on, is insufficient as an argument against Donald Trump. But what it is, crucially, is an opening. In politics, you have to find those kinds of openings, and then you wedge yourself in and you push them out wider. That's the job for anyone who wants to win back the Republican Party from Donald Trump. I can't do it. Believe me, I wish I could, but Republican primary voters are not going to listen to me. Maybe some of them, maybe some of you are watching right now, and I'm glad you are. But in the main, the people who want the Republican nomination, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, and whoever else can declare, they're the ones who need to make this argument. Former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, who is running for the Republican presidential nomination, is, to his tremendous credit, one of the very few starting to hit that message.
So, going after him is like walking into a buzzsaw. Why are you doing it?
Well, because it's important. What America does not want is another repeat of 2020, where we have Joe Biden and Donald Trump running against each other.
We've also heard it from potential 2024 candidate Chris Christie, who referred to Trump as, quote, a child for fixating in 2020, and Chris Sununu, governor of New Hampshire, who called him a loser and said he is tired of losing. So clearly some Republicans are catching on. But I got to say, there's a strange sort of fatalism creeping into the national conversation about Donald Trump that everyone should sort of throw in the towel, give up. And what that means to me, honestly, is give up on our fellow citizens, the people that we share the country with as democratic equals, right? Small d democratic equals. And I got to say, it certainly seems like the Republican establishment has even more cynical views of their primary voters than I do. But the door's not closed. I mean, maybe it will be at some point. And maybe Donald Trump wins the nomination. Perfectly plausible and maybe even likely. But it's not inevitable. The future is unwritten. People who want him not to be the nominee need to get up and make the case to their own voters. Get out there. Democracy depends on it.